Hello and welcome to our telesummit on feminism as a sustainability tool. I'm your host, Jenny Lamorgan. I'm a social entrepreneur and owner of greenwomanstore.com, where education is a critical part of our work, and we enjoy creating educational tools like this telesummit on topics important to us as women. I'm excited to be here with our co-host, Carolyn Gage, to bring you feminists and case studies from the U.S. and around the world. These are two collective quests, feminism and sustainability, that touch every aspect of our lives. Feminism has always brought hope, a lot of work, and truth to whatever issue it touches. These are difficult times around the world, and if we're lucky, our hopelessness and powerlessness gives way to optimism when we are informed. We're here to talk about the sustainability of feminism and the important role that feminism plays in real, lasting, and global sustainability. Our goal is to bring you hope for the future and an expanded global reality. We can trust Carolyn Gage to facilitate these truths with clarity and grace. Carolyn is a lesbian feminist playwright, performer, director, and activist. She is the author of 12 books and more than 65 plays, musicals, and one-woman shows. She specializes in non-traditional roles for women and reclaims for all of us famous women's stories that have been distorted or erased entirely from history. In 2014, Carolyn was one of 6 featured playwrights at the 53rd Annual World Theater Day in Rome, sponsored by UNESCO. And now I'd like to introduce our guest, a leading anti-porn feminist and scholar, who will talk to us about growing up in a porn culture. Dr. Gail Dines is a professor of sociology and women's studies at Wheelock College in Boston. Professor Dines is an internationally acclaimed speaker, author, and feminist activist. Her writings and lectures focus on the hypersexualization of the culture and the ways that porn images filter down into mainstream pop culture. Gail Dines' work has appeared in academic journals, magazines such as Time and Newsweek, and newspapers across the country. She has recently produced a new documentary titled Pornland: How the Porn Business Has Hijacked Our Sexuality, where she argues that the dominant images and stories disseminated by the multi-billion-dollar porn industry produce and reproduce a gender system that undermines equality and encourages violence against women. Gail began her activism volunteering at a rape crisis center in Tel Aviv and started the Haifa-based feminist movement Woman to Woman in her living room at the age of 22. For over 20 years, Gail has been researching and writing about the porn industry and pop culture. Gail has spoken at hundreds of colleges across the country. Her lectures changed the way people think about pop culture and pornography, and the students regularly say that they will never look at the world the same again. And now I turn the mic over to Carolyn. Enjoy this discussion. Welcome, Carolyn Gage and Gail Dines.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jenny. I wanted to just say, when I saw that Dr. Dines was on the list of speakers, I was just so excited because I've been following her work and stopping porn culture for years. And so this is a huge privilege for me. And I just, so why don't we start with how and why has the culture become pornified?
Well, first let me say it's a privilege to be speaking with you as well, because I've been following your work for many years as well. How did it become pornified? I think if you really want to figure out when pornography became kind of front and center, you have to go back to 1953. Now, there's always been porn. Porn has always circulated. But what really changed in 53 was the first ever edition of Playboy. And once you got Playboy, what you got was pornographic images circulating within mainstream capitalism. And this is where it shifts from a marginalized industry to an industry that becomes a player in the culture, in the economy, in the legal system. So really what I talk about is how the porn industry has used a massive kind of juggernaut of PR, of free speech, especially the Free Speech Coalition, which is part of the porn industry, to normalize pornographic images, such that to this point today, when you turn on MTV, you flick through Cosmopolitan, images that were in Playboy, say 20 years ago, have now become mainstream in the pop culture. And what has happened is, as softcore porn has become mainstream, what you're left with what the porn industry produces, is actually hardcore, violent, cruel porn. So we've shifted, but everywhere you go, you see the pornographic message. Women exist to be sexually used and abused. They're disposable. They exist for men's use. Women have no sexual agency. The only thing that matters is what men want sexually. And that outside of that image of women as fuckable, kind of women are invisible outside of that image. When I was growing up, there was a range of ways of being a woman in the culture, most importantly, feminism. Today, that's kind of been eradicated, and in its place is this hypersexualized, porn star, which women increasingly emulate, whether they ever end up in pornography or not.
Yeah, it's disturbing, and I know that being part of that second wave, if somebody had showed me pictures of how young girls would be dressed today, I mean, we really thought the high heel was history, in the early 70s. It's always a question of time. It's an uncomfortable item. And just seeing the like you say, it's mainstreamed now.
Well, I think a great example of that is, look, we're 3 days from the opening of 50 Shades of Grey. I mean, as you and I sort of both grew up in a similar period, could you imagine if a man had come up to us and said, I want to have sex with you, I want to call you my submissive, and I want to tie you up and beat the shit out of you? What would we have said?
I wouldn't have said anything. I would have just done some of my brand new martial arts moves on him.
Whatever. I mean, it would have been unthinkable. And that today, one of the biggest box office openings of Valentine's Day is a film that I actually went to see, I'm sorry to say, opening day, because obviously I was having interviews, so I had to see it. And let me tell you, I mean, I was sitting there watching Sexual Torture, and I was looking around me, and the movie house was full of women between the ages of about 18 to 30. And let me just say, every single showing was sold out. And there was 10 showings that day. And they were all sold out. I got the last ticket for the 3:30 showing. And I am sitting there, and I am watching this young woman being chained from the ceiling. I'm watching her being whipped. I'm watching her being emotionally abused. I am like wincing, gasping, covering my eyes. And I look around me, and everyone is just like drinking cocktails, because they were serving cocktails during the movie, eating popcorn and just watching the movie. And nobody had any effect on them. It was like unbelievable. It was like a roboticized audience. Now, again, when I was growing up, women in the audience would have been standing up, shouting back at the screen, "This is violence against women." It was just an amazing experience to sit through and think how young women have been so socialized that you can take a woman, you can hang her from a ceiling, you can whip her, and it's just entertainment.
Yes, yes, and I have so many things going through my mind, and I noticed this a lot in my field as a playwright. I was just at an international conference that the focus was violence against women, and I was stunned that all of my colleagues were using a lot of female nudity on the stage. And the actor's nude, not the character. And to me, there's lines being crossed quite a bit, and people are there to see the nude actor, not the nude character. And I felt like even in these women who are purportedly doing work that deals with violence against women, the same tropes of pornography were being heavily used over and over again. I really didn't even know how to address it. Sometimes I feel like what we're having is sort of a system-wide Stockholm syndrome or something. Why? It's baffling to me, and how the daughters of women who came through that second wave could be sitting in a movie theater and not knowing what they're seeing, or they'll be like, well, it's just a fantasy. It's that would make it all right, or that why is torturing anybody's idea of a fantasy? All of those, yeah.
Well, actually, it was not a fantasy for the people who made it, because if you read the interviews with the actor Jamie Dornan and also with Dakota Johnson, they actually did not like making it. He said that he felt when he did things to women in that film he would never do in real life. And she said in an interview how uncomfortable she felt and that every night she had to go home and have some wine to just calm herself down. So it wasn't even a fantasy for them. Nobody was enjoying themselves in the making of it. It was real. She was exposed, and he felt uncomfortable doing this to her. And interestingly, he just had a baby daughter as well. And I'd like to speak to all those people involved in the making of that movie, from him to his daughter, to Beyonce, who did the singing, who's got a daughter, to the woman who wrote it, who's got 2 sons. I would like to ask them, how would you feel to Beyonce and Jamie Dornan if your daughter in 16 years brings home a Christian Grey and beats the shit out of her? And how would the author, James, feel if her 2 sons turned into Christian Grey? I mean, these are not fantasies. This is not a fairy story. This is a horror story that many, many women live. And those of us in feminism, how many of these women have we met who have been beaten and tortured by men, who are running for their lives? And I was sitting there just watching this thinking, you know, I have met these women. They live in battered women's shelters. They live on the run for 15 years with no credit cards, no cell phone, no footprint whatsoever, because the Christian Greys of the world never give up. And I think speaking to your sort of watching women naked on the screen or on the stage, you know, one thing that's really interesting is, what is the first thing that police do when they bring prisoners in? They make them strip naked, because to be naked in the face of somebody clothed is to be rendered completely powerless. So you're right, it is the actress who is naked, not just the character.
Yeah, it's well, it's so disturbing. It's difficult for me to even find words for it. Yeah, it's true. Yeah. One thing I do see, though, and maybe it's just my social set, is there's a lot of critiques of 50 Shades going on, and that I see some activists are using it as a consciousness-raising tool. Oh, I know what I wanted to say. I wanted to say, thinking of an earlier kind of less violent reincarnation of the same idea, Pretty Woman, where if the John or the abuser is really wealthy, it becomes something completely different. You know, my understanding in 50 Shades is that he's depicted as massively wealthy, just extremely wealthy. And
strip him of his wealth, put him on food stamps living in a housing project, and I bet you wouldn't have so many women swooning after him. I mean, in the film it's very clear it's his wealth that seduces her as well.
Yes, and I think with Pretty Woman, it's like he was going to rescue her from her socioeconomic whatever, and that was, you know, part of it was, you know, the glamour of that. And I think that's interesting. I guess as a playwright, film is a visual culture, and I just wonder if that privilege would play as well if it was bare stage or something, because in the film he's in a helicopter, he's this, he's that, you know, the seductiveness of that imagery. But it is interesting that as long as there's a great deal of money involved, it becomes romantic as opposed to commercial and transactional, you know.
Well, I also think it's sort of the wealth acts as a kind of upmarket cleansing cream to the violence that these men perpetrate on the women. I mean, let's be honest, how many former prostituted women do you know live in wedded bliss with their Johns? You know, and how many battered women do we know live in wedded bliss with their batterers? Both of these are a horrible rebranding of violence as romance. And I think for those of us who, you know, come out of the feminist movement, and especially the radical second-wave feminist movement, which really organized around violence against women, it was such a major issue. Because as Andrea Dworkin once said, you know, unless you are free from the fear of violence or violence itself, then no other freedom really counts. And I think that the new feminism, the third wave feminism informed by, I would argue, a neoliberal, postmodern type of approach has kind of gotten rid of the notion of reality and what women really live like. So you can render away anything. You can argue that prostitution is now sex work, when in fact it's sexual slavery. You can argue pornography is now sexual empowerment, when in fact, again, it's sexual slavery with the camera going. And I think a lot of the new feminism and the earlier feminists were not raised on radical politics. And in radical politics, we always use the term liberation. We never use the term empowerment. And I think that was purposeful, because empowerment is an individual-based issue. If I'm doing well with my, skin privileges and wealth privileges, and I'm empowered, which I personally am extremely empowered in this culture, then I'm fine. But I really joined a movement that said it's not about me. We don't measure the success of feminism on the basis of the most privileged women. We measure the success of feminism on the basis of how the poorest, most oppressed women are doing. And that's why it's a liberation movement and not an empowerment movement.
I agree with you. And also, empowered is highly subjective. And so much of my work is about the culture of unrecovered survivors. And, for women with any degree of control over their lives, even just getting paid for sex, if they've been raped and pimped out as a child, that feels like up from zero. That's empowering. I don't doubt that. I don't question that in their world, this is empowering compared to what, And I think that's another way the culture gets you, is it strips everything away from women, and the abuse of girls is just horrendous as children. And so then, you put back one or two elements, and it can feel like it's a form of empowerment or a career choice or all of that rhetoric around prostitution. And
when you do who have been
and then the whole idea of consent is so troubled by, when you look at the context of complex PTSD or Stockholm syndrome, what exactly does consent mean, and the empowered woman giving her consent.
Exactly.
And even in this 50 Shades, I guess there's some emphasis on a contract or consent, although I understand there's a lot of violating of that. But still, I would suggest, this is obviously a work of fiction, but I would suggest that any woman making those, quote, choices, I don't know if they go into the background of this woman, Anastasia, but she certainly appears to me, just looking at the trailer, I would guess that's somebody with enormous quantities of abuse as a child, who's relatively numb, and that her naivete is actually a form of numbness.
Actual disturbing thing about books.
The consent is actually kind of the remote control programming from, a childhood where the context of everything is so skewed. So.
Well, I would also say that, the most upsetting thing about the books and the film as well is that she's not really a woman. She's much more an adolescent girl. They make her 21, but her behavior, her knowledge of the world, her knowledge of her body really maps more onto a middle adolescence. So what you're really watching is a seasoned perpetrator grooming a much, much younger girl. And that was probably the most disturbing thing about the film. It was disturbing about the book, but when you saw it actually on the screen, because, there's something about images that absolutely are so compelling beyond print. You can't get away from them. You can't flick through them. You can't jump. It's there. And watching it was way worse than actually reading the book. And then just being around women and wondering, where is the consciousness? How have we managed to obliterate feminist consciousness in just a generation or two?
Yeah. Yeah, but at the same time, and this may not be accurate, but I'm seeing that there is more sensitivity towards sexual violence towards women. Now, maybe it's tokenized or something, but I'm seeing more awareness of violence in professional sports, violence against women, and I have felt it was heartening to see some of the appropriate response to the situation with Bill Cosby, where, it's not just, feminists responding individually, but that he's losing academic honors, he's losing affiliations with the military, that the corporate world is disassociating themselves from Cosby. Now, in my experience in the past, especially without a conviction, that wouldn't have happened. They would have actually circled the wagons around their boy, like He's a big
Well, they have been circling the wagons around Cosby for 20 years. I mean, they have been doing that, and now it's no longer effective. But what I want to say, though, which is important, there is definitely increased consciousness about violence against women. What few people are sort of linking it to is pornography. I mean, if you think about violence against women, and let's take our eyes a moment off the women and put it on the men, and let's think of all the forms of violence that men perpetrate. So men are rapists, batterers, johns, pimps, murderers. Now, we have a question to ask here. Are men born rapists, batterers, johns, and pimps? And if they are, then we have to take the very depressing biological argument that men are born somehow less human than women. If, however, we refuse to go down that route, and I refuse to go around there because I'm a feminist, I'm a scholar, and also I'm the mother of a son, so it is not an option for me to believe that boys are in any way less humane and less capable of being a human being than women, then you have to look at the culture. You have to say what in the culture is taking these sweet, delightful little boys and turning them into pimps, johns, murderers, what have you. And the big missing picture that nobody wants to talk about is pornography. Pornography today is a major form of sex education. So if you're going to take the argument that men are being socialized into this, you have got to put pornography front and center. And there seems to be an unwillingness on the part of the anti-violence movement, on the part of the anti-trafficking movement, to really take on pornography as this juggernaut which is socializing men into violence against women. So with taking out pornography, how are you going to explain this? Because I don't think any feminist I know wants to take the biological argument. We have always argued, and Andrea Dworkin wrote a fabulous piece many, many years ago about the danger of biological determinism. So there's this missing piece here, and when porn becomes so front and center, when it becomes the form of sex ed that boys, not just in the United States, but all over the world, are getting to at 12 years old, and the things they're seeing are violent and cruel and abusive, the type of images that a generation ago you had to go to a porn shop, and you had to go to the back of the porn shop to find that. Now that is 15 seconds away on Google. You can get it for free. So what is the long-term impact of this? Because we are in the middle of a social experiment. We've never brought boys up before on hardcore porn, just a click away. And I really do struggle to get other groups in feminism to see pornography for what it is, which is a major groomer of boys into being violent.
Yes, I think that's true. And in a visual medium, I mean, we're really not, evolution moves very, very slowly compared to the rate of technological advances. And we're not really wired. Our brains are not wired to distinguish tremendously between electronic media and something that's actually happening in the real world, particularly children who are developing. And it's my understanding that before the age of 4, that distinction, if they're watching some film where someone is being eviscerated graphically, it's, they're not really, aware, that they register it. Their developing brain is registering it as if it's happening in the room with them. And I find that just terrifying because, we're evolved so that if something like that is happening to us and we're 4 years old, we learn huge fight or flight responses, whatever.
Exactly.
But we bring that kind of danger and that level of adrenaline right into our living room with just, Jurassic Park or something, and maybe you don't take a 4-year-old to see that, but maybe it's playing because the babysitter's watching it in the living room and the child sees it. And I think that, to me, is another one of those sowing the wind and reaping the whirlwind. What's going to happen with these generations of children who've experienced these traumatizing images?
Well, the news is actually worse than that. The news is that when they've mapped the brain of 4-year-olds, 8-year-olds, 18-year-olds, and 30-year-olds, it's the same. When they watch visual images, they are basically using the same brain and processing it with the same ways that you process visual images in the real world. There is not a cutoff point at which point you develop a separate brain to just take in media. So what we know now from the emerging brain research is that men and boys who use porn are processing it as if it was real. And even more so what they found is the younger the boy, the more he looks at porn, the more addicted he becomes, the harder it is to get away from that addiction. Older men who get addicted to porn have an easier time of moving away from addiction. But the research now on the brain is showing us that what you just said about 4-year-olds is true of all of us, actually. None of us really can separate fact from fiction. We're not set up like that. And we'd like to think we are. And if we could separate fact from fiction, then we wouldn't have an advertising industry. If advertising can shape the way, images can shape the way we consume the products, then why can't images of pornography shape the way we have sex? It just makes no sense to have a multi-billion-dollar-a-year advertising industry and say that images have no impact.
Yeah, and I think the focus on gratification of, an orgasm at all costs, and that whatever it takes to get there is legitimate free speech and you're entitled to it and blah, blah, blah. That I like that you really address what's being lost, that our sexuality is being hijacked because when you are trained, and it really is kind of a consumer trained for the gratification, but it's away from the things that actually are satisfying or fulfilling in the long run. And so if you're focused on that, as you point out, in your writing, that pornography is making it difficult for the consumers of it to achieve authentic intimacy.
Oh, absolutely. And that's not just me.
I mean at what price, and so the cherished prizedness of having the orgasm, there's a hidden cost to it, that isn't being questioned. It's a really bad bargain. If that's what you're privileging at the expense of genuine intimacy and a relationship that grows with you through decades, and all of that goes on when you love somebody, if that's what you're losing, that's just it's a real boondoggle. And as you said, it's a hijacking of the brain. It's teaching the brain to want something that actually doesn't serve us at all.
And the sad part of all of this is do you think the average 12-year-old boy, when he puts porn into Google, has any idea what he's sacrificing? I mean, this is why...
the myth of manhood, I think that there's a lot of pressure on him to participate in that. He feels that not only does he get this sort of thrill, but he's being initiated into... it's a right of manhood now, and again, it's the entitlement of access to women's bodies. But I just want to interject quickly that I was raised by a pornography addict, which it was in the 1950s and the early 60s was my childhood, so that it wasn't that common, or at least there wasn't a lot of consciousness about it. But my father was a very famous judge, sort of man of the year type of person. He was absolutely mentally ill. He had a second family on the other side of town. He had dissociative disorders of a very high level, where he would stand up and start praying out loud inappropriately as if he was sort of this prophet from God. And then he had just really frightening, we talked about this, torture, pornography, addiction, and so on. But you could say, well, which came first, the chicken or the egg? Maybe he was this sick and twisted person before he began to be attracted to pornography. But I feel like it's entirely possible that the pornography made him the person that he was, because he could not reconcile all of the contradictions in his life without extreme dissociation, and then the multiple families in which he kept them separate. They didn't know about each other's existence, all of that stuff, Today I think, well, I wonder if that was created by his pornography habit.
Well, I think the question is, was it created or not doesn't matter as much as we know that his pornography habit fed that and helped to bring it alive. And whether it's the chicken or the egg, the outcome's the same. Okay, the outcome is the same. And what we know now is actually it's much more. These are not. There's some traumatized boys going to porn, but on the whole, it is so mainstream today that you couldn't argue that trauma sexual trauma is what drives the average porn user. I would say in your father's generation, given that it was marginalized and he had to really seek it out and it was difficult, then there's probably more likely that sexual trauma drove that generation. This generation, it is completely normalized. I mean, it's the guys who don't seek out porn that are unusual today. I mean, my students, when we talk, I teach an advanced feminist theories class at Wheelock College, and we talk about this. All my students say that every guy they know uses hardcore porn. It's impossible to find a guy who doesn't use porn today. And they grow up on it, and they use it publicly, and they talk about it. There's no shame to it anymore. It's just open. And again, I want to make it very clear to the listeners that we're not talking Playboy, Penthouse, or Hustler. I mean, I never thought I would say this, but those were the good old days. Just seeing a woman with no clothes on, smiling in a cornfield, bending over, those were horrible as they were, is nothing like what this boy gets catapulted into today at 12 when he puts porn into Google. And I do think these boys are being traumatized by the porn industry. They might not go to porn traumatized, but they certainly come away from porn traumatized. And I think that's really important as feminists, is to understand the way in which the boys are being shaped by the porn industry and traumatized and victimized by the industry. Because I can't imagine what would have happened to my son at 12 if he would have put porn into Google, and if that's what would have come up, it would have been a form of sexual trauma. And we all know what happens with sexual trauma is you keep going back to the place you were traumatized, which makes perfect sense with why so many boys keep going back to porn, because they're being traumatized over and over again. The average 12-year-old does not think for 1 minute he's going to see cruelty and violence and torture. He thinks he's going to see breasts, maybe a vagina, which again is bad enough in a sexist society. But, I am so beyond that, given what these boys are actually witnessing. It's so beyond that. And it's scary as hell, because what happens when you bring them up, not on porn that's of Playboy and Penthouse, but on porn that is basically the glorification of torture? What happens to that generation of boys when they become fathers, partners, judges, teachers, politicians, doctors, lawyers, you name it? What kind of men are these guys going to make?
Yeah, they're going to be men like my father, who was
he's going to become normalized.
Yeah, he was violent, and he was also a deeply tormented person. I felt like his life was incoherent to him. And, it stole his life because his brain, like you say, had been hijacked. Yeah, well, it's so what do you see as being effective?
Well, I mean, it depends what you're talking about. I think in the United States, at the moment, the most effective method is what we're doing at Stop Porn Culture, is we are building public health programs to deal with the harms of pornography. We are defining pornography as the public harm, the major public harm issue of the digital age. That's how we've defined pornography. And what we're doing is we're building a parents program, an online parents program, to help parents deal with the effects and how to talk to kids. We're also doing an online therapist and social worker program, because what I found in my talks is that therapists and social workers are inundated with porn addicts and they don't know what to do. They don't even know what porn is, a lot of them. So we're building a series of public health programs. Now, in a different world, in a more feminist country, like, for example, when I was in Iceland a few years ago and the left Greens were in power, they brought me to Iceland, and the discussion there was banning pornography as a violation of women's civil rights. Now, again, you can have that conversation in Scandinavia. You can't have that conversation in this country because the First Amendment comes in and blocks it. And as soon as you mention First Amendment, everybody's brain kind of just fizzles away. It's as if the pornographers have absolute right to speech and to do what they do to women, and anyone who even comes up against them is considered someone who's censoring, book burning. So we're really having a difficult time in the United States. In Great Britain, what they're doing is an opt-in, opt-out approach, whereby when you get your cell phone, you get your computer, your laptop, you actually are locked out of porn. You have to opt in to get porn. Now, it's not much, but it's a really good start. In this country, we are very far away from legislation. It's got to be education and conscious raising. And it's got to be a movement. It can't be individual parent by individual parent trying to stop this.
Now, do you think that is because so much of the industry is in the United States, that it's easier in Iceland, for instance, to have that conversation, or is it just this ideological, the sort of mystical aura around the First Amendment?
A bit of both. I think certainly because historically most of the industry as it flourished on the internet was in Los Angeles. Now that's probably going to change because of Measure B that was passed in LA, where now actors are being forced to wear condoms. And I think what you're going to see is a lot of the pornography producers are going to be moving out of the United States and going specifically to parts of Eastern Europe where you've got just a never-ending supply of poverty-stricken women and girls. So I think the actual center of production might shift in a few years. However, the First Amendment here is a huge difficulty. And to get over that, and plus you've got this kind of neoliberal individualistic mentality that rules the United States. If you can't even get health care, you know, a socialized healthcare system here, when every other Western country manages to pull that off, you can't seem to get a collective agreement. And I think because I grew up in another country and saw what it's like when you really put some thought and ideas into what do you want as a collective. Because I grew up really in the heyday of a kind of Labour government in England where it was a given that the role of a government was to take care of its people. It was a given that the rich shouldn't feed off the poor and that the unions had a right to strike and demand better living. You don't have that here. It's every person for themselves. And the truth is the only people who are doing well out of that is the 1%.
Yes, yes. Although I would say that there's some hopefulness when I think of the history of the fight for legislation for sexual harassment. And in that case, the First Amendment was not proven sacrosanct. That the laws are on the books about, but not just, you know, hey baby or the groping or whatever, but also the presence of pornography in the workplace has been deemed legally creating a hostile environment that discriminates against women. Now, I find that really hopeful because I think a lot of people...
It's not enacted. That's the trouble. You can have a law on the books, but if you don't have the political will to make it actionable, then it's just a law on the books. And the truth is, under that law, virtually every college in the United States should be sued for sexual harassment because the guys are watching porn in the public areas. So that maybe should be one point of activism, is going after the universities and saying, you know, basically you're creating a hostile environment by making women...
It is actionable, and there are women who have won those lawsuits because of the presence of pornography in the workplace. Yes, of course, it takes some will, it takes some money, a bunch of things to be able to sue in situations like that. But that has been upheld. I think that's a fascinating idea, the idea of, you know, trying to, well, what to me was interesting is that it's been, you know, like legislated and acknowledged that the presence of porn creates an environment hostile to women and that that's a form of discrimination. I find it interesting, though, as soon as you walk out the door of the office, that's not in play anymore, even though the pornography continues to create a hostile environment for me as a woman, and I'm discriminated against in so many arenas of my life because of pornography, because of the environment it's created and the way it's conditioned the people I just walk down the street next to. But I do find it hopeful that at least in the workplace, that's not up for debate anymore. That's sort of been settled, that yes, it is hostile, and yes, that constitutes discrimination. Maybe more should be made of that, and why is it that the legal protection only exists in the workplace, but that once you walk outside the door, that hostile environment is a given. It's acceptable. That's called the culture. It can't be the corporate culture, but why is it that it's the culture outside the corporate world?
No,
so I
exactly.
guess I have some optimism based on that, maybe. It seems like some touchstone of sanity.
I think there's a lot of touchstones of sanity around. I think our job now is to kind of stitch those touchstones together into a movement that has some teeth in it, you know. And that's what we're trying to do in Stop Porn Culture, is bring together a coalition of groups as well. So it's not just anti-porn groups, but, you know, anti-trafficking groups as well, groups, you know, dedicated to healthy development of girls, and stitch together a coalition of groups that says, you know, we have a right to be the authors of our own sexuality, we have a right to live free from fear, have a right not to be prostituted and trafficked. So I really think we need to sort of cross boundaries now and bring together coalition politics and all the other people around who are fighting for a better world. And I think those on the left as well need to get going around issues of pornography. You can't be against capitalism and critique capitalism and somehow ignore pornography as if it doesn't exist as a capitalist industry.
And it's interesting, the fact that it is an actual addiction, and we can look at the brain chemistry and see that it's operating with the endorphin delivery, et cetera, much like cocaine. And I find that's hopeful because we are in a corporate world. And, you know, tobacco use was, you know, a freedom of this and of that. Well, you know, not so much. And we started banning it, and then the government became involved in the advertising of it and then asking damages from the companies. And it's to me that now that pornography addiction is becoming such a huge problem, and as you say, all these therapists are inundated with something they haven't seen before, well, insurance is going to maybe start picking up the tab for some of the counseling around that, as it does with other substance abuse issues. And it might be starting to be seen as a public nuisance or a
public health
liability,
issue,
a financial liability. I mean, that's what happened with tobacco. It took a really long time, but government became incredibly active in a situation where there's been a lot of rhetoric around freedom of choice and pursuit of happiness and all of that. Nobody questions that anymore. Tobacco is bad, and it's in the state's interest to regulate it, tax the heck out of it, and put these penalties and restrictions actively interfere with the free market regarding tobacco. I don't know, do you see that maybe that would be happening with the sex addiction becoming a national health problem?
I think we've got a ways to go, and I think, again, as with always, it's on the shoulders of the activists to push it forward. I think the answer to that depends on how the activists are going to organize around this. If we don't have an anti-porn feminist movement, then it will probably take a really long time. If, however, we manage to build a movement and we build it through a public health approach, which is as they did with cigarette smoking, then I think we're in better shape, which is, again, why we've sort of really coined this notion that pornography, and it's not just addiction, by the way, because you don't have to be addicted to porn to really be in trouble with pornography, because just even light users of porn sound very like porn addicts. Even as, you know, using it not as on a level of addiction, you begin to reshape your brain, you begin to rethink what sex is, you rethink your own body, you rethink what women are, it changes your notions of intimacy. You know, addiction is the far end of the continuum. But to be honest with you, most boys are on a continuum of porn is harming them. And they didn't know this. They didn't get this. They had no clue that this was going to happen to them. I meet these, you know, young men all over the college campuses. They thought they were going to get into porn, look at it, and move away from it. They didn't realize that even if they moved away from it, those images in their head had already shaped their sexuality by the time they were 16, 17.
Yeah, well, that is interesting. Well, I'm looking here at some of the questions that I had, and I think it's really important to address how can women and children survive this onslaught. We've been talking a lot about the men, the boys, and how they're being affected. How can women, particularly I'm thinking of girls with all the peer pressure in school and everything, how can they survive and resist, I guess?
Well, they're not doing a very good job, I have to tell you. I mean, there was a meta-analysis by the American Psychological Association on girls and hypersexualization that came out a few years ago, and girls are not doing well. You know, their level of depression and anxiety, eating disorders, self-harm, all of those things are increasing. And as someone who is around 18 to 22-year-olds all the time, my students are not doing great, I have to say. They feel like they're never going to partner with anyone. They can't get a date because what's happened now also on the college campuses is that hookup sex has replaced dating. So I think unless we do something, I actually don't know how girls are going to survive this onslaught, because it's only going to get worse. The level of violence is only going to get worse when these boys eventually mature into men, which they're kind of, when I say mature into men, I don't mean cognitively, I mean physically, because a lot of them are the same at 30 than they were at 18. I mean, that's another thing when you look at the studies of boys growing into men, is they're not really going through the normal, what were considered adolescent levels of development, because they're not dating, they're playing video games, they're staying with their porn. So, I mean, I think we're in trouble. I think we're in serious trouble. And I hate not to come with like a 10-point plan to say this is the answer. But I really do. The more I travel, the more I speak to young women, the more I hear what they have to put up with when they go to bars, the way in which, you know, being sexually abused in a bar is almost the norm now. A guy coming up to you, touching you, dry humping you, you know, surrounding you. These are standard ways in which women live. And I was in London last September for a premiere of my film Pornland. And there was a lot of young women there, and we were talking about life for them. And they told a story that is virtually unbelievable to hear, but everyone was nodding. So they were saying when you go to bars now, and this was in London, it's very common that at some point in the evening a guy will slip his fingers into your vagina.
Really?
Yes, that you'll get basically your fingers from somebody you don't know. So what do the women do? Stop going to bars? No. They wear 2 sets of underwear. They said they buy big underwear and they wear 2 sets so that the guy can't slip his finger into your vagina. And when he can't, he evidently turns around and calls them a fucking tease. And, of course, my first horror is, you know, this level of violence, which is so normalized that they're telling me. And secondly, that, you know, they continue to go to the bars and their protection is 2 sets of underwear.
Yeah, that's, I'm speechless.
You see, when you're around young women and you listen to them, this is the only way I know what I know, you know, because I'm not obviously in that scene, and I never have been. You know, feminists don't go to bars like that when we're younger. But when I'm around them all the time, and when I talk about it, I say, you know, tell me about your life, tell me what it's like, because what do I know? And these are the stories I hear, whether I'm in Sydney, Norway, England, Germany, Sweden, the US, Canada. It's just the same stories. I mean, that's why I think I sound a little less hopeful than you in a way, because I hear these stories and I think, how do you stand this? How do you stand this daily assault on you, which is what it is? And this was not my life. I mean, my close friend was raped when she was 14. It's not like it didn't happen, but it was unusual. It was unusual. It wasn't the norm. And when you're around young women, around 18, when if they take an intro class, the stories they tell at 18, you wonder how they even get out of bed in the morning.
Yeah, I rent part of my apartment to students. I'm in a university neighborhood. And I've done that for about 12 years now, and maybe I've had about 10 or 12 housemates. Nearly all of them have these are middle-class college kids, you know. They have unbelievable stories of sexual abuse, unbelievable, like way beyond anything that would have been normal when I was young and going to college in the 70s and 80s. But what's missing is they have difficulty talking about it. You have the sense there isn't this big group of women friends that they could go to who would just immediately be up in arms and helping them report to the police or anything. It feels to me like they're very alone, and they don't have a politic and they don't have any theory around what they're experiencing. It feels a lot like the 1950s or something, you know, where the kind of must have been what I was wearing, I shouldn't have drunk so much type of thing.
Yeah.
It's very,
that's a great point. That's a great point. I mean, most of my students blame themselves, that it was their fault. If only they hadn't done this, if only they hadn't done that. When I say, you know, basically it's nothing to do with your karma, it's nothing to do with what you did, you were just in the wrong time at the wrong place. That's what sexual terrorism is. You never know when it's going to strike, and you're just could be in the wrong place at the wrong time. And I think we need to bring back this notion that radical feminists talked about, which is a form of terrorism. It's absolutely a form of terrorism. You never know when it's going to happen to you. And the chances are today it's probably going to be happen to you with somebody you know. And these are the stories that I hear. And of course it makes sense because these boys have been brought up on porn. How could it not?
Yeah. Now, in your work, do you find that the porn situation is playing out differently in lesbian communities?
A lot of my students in lesbian communities say that they're not doing so great either. They're not doing as badly as the women who are dating guys. But there's a porn in lesbian communities, but it's not to the same degree. It's certainly not to the same degree that I've seen, no. It's getting there, though. I mean, in the sense that more and more young women are using porn as a so-called sexual aid. And also, there's a kind of hypersexualization taking over the lesbian community as well. I mean, I've been a radical feminist all my life, and as most of my friends were lesbians, and I'd never met a lesbian who wasn't political, when I first came out as a radical feminist. And now, most of my lesbian students are not political. It's not a political act. It's not a resistance to patriarchy. It's just a lifestyle choice.
Yes. Yeah, that's what I see that also. Yeah, I remember Andrea Dworkin was asked about lesbian pornography. This probably was in the late 80s. I heard her speaking. And I felt that she didn't want to be baited, that she felt this was possibly a baiting question. But I remember she said, well, the first time that I saw lesbian pornography, I thought to myself, well, now we really have been colonized. Mm-hmm. And then she moved on. She wasn't going to go into it because I think she didn't want to be bad-mouthing lesbians in a potentially patriarchal context. But I was very moved when she said that, and, saddened, of course. But
I would love to know what she would make of this culture. I often wonder, had she lived, how would she have made sense of this? Because, all of us do anti-porn work.
By it at all. I think she wouldn't have been surprised. I think she would have felt that, that of course it's going to grow. Of course it's spreading.
Well, I'm surprised. I have to tell you, I can't believe it. I cannot believe that the culture has sat back and let the pornographers do this. I wouldn't have thought this would have been possible, that we would get to a place where anyone within 10 seconds can get to basically images of women being tortured, and that people would sit back and let this. I would not have thought. I would have thought there would have been some resistance somewhere along the line. And I am shocked at the lack of resistance, at the way that adults have completely capitulated any responsibility and left young people to navigate their way through this awful porn culture.
Yeah, and one of the things I see with these young women that I'm living with is, and they're like 22 and going to state university, they have a debt load of $100,000 or more. And one of them recently was a law school student, and she talked about how someone came into the classes and emphasized that the women should wear their hair down because men liked it better. They should always wear very high heels. And it was sort of the exact opposite advice of how to be taken seriously that we had in the 70s. And I was absolutely floored. And I remember kind of talking to her about this. But one of the big differences, I felt like the debt load she was carrying was massive, and the competition for jobs is intense in a way that it wasn't for my generation. And so even though she might understand the politic behind it or what was actually being done manipulatively, divide the women and conquer and the sexualization, it didn't matter. If it helped her get a job, it was what she would do. And she would hold her nose, but it's what she would do. And I felt like that's kind of, a lot of people want to shake their heads at this rising generation and they aren't activists and what happened to them. Well, I would never have I wouldn't be a playwright if I'd had the debt load these kids had. I probably wouldn't have gotten an education, frankly. I mean, I think that's a huge part of it is, it's difficult to resist that. And in that case, she felt that career opportunities were on the line if she didn't kind of make concessions to the pornographizing of her image. So I think
also debt is an excellent way to control people. I mean, I went to college in England. I did 3 degrees there, 10 years, and the filing fee for the 3 degrees was $200, and that's the debt I left with, $200, which I paid. I mean, in this country, I would have been in debt hundreds of thousands. I think debt is an excellent way to enslave the next generation's workers. So I think I agree with you, certainly with debt. But you know what? Even the kids at the Ivies, the real elite kids who have not got loads of debt, they're not activists. My son went to Brown. You know, he was around, you know, elite kids. There was no difference there either. And they were not carrying hundreds of thousands of debt. And they went into corporate America to make money, not to pay off their debts.
Oh, that's sad to hear, because I just feel like...
Yeah, I mean, but it makes sense. I don't blame them. I do not blame this generation. It's us, the ones who should have been at the helm of this, before the pornographers came in, before the neoliberals, you know, sucked out all the money from the collective coffers and ended up with giving it all to the 1%. We need to be fighting back, because it's not just porn. I mean, what world are we going to leave our kids to? You know, I was just interviewed by Chris Hedges, and we were talking about, you know, an environmental collapse, a cultural collapse, an economic collapse. These things, there's a perfect storm coming together. And unless we, those of us, you know, who are privileged enough in the academy and outside of the academy, who can have time on our hands to sort of organize, what are we going to leave these kids? What kind of a world are they going to grow up in? And so I don't blame them. I don't blame them for 1 minute, because I see them and they're just trying to get through college, trying to make sense of this world, trying to survive. Where are we? Where's the older generation doing this? I don't know where they are. What happened?
It's lovely to hear you say that, because I get annoyed sometimes when I hear my generation of feminists wringing their hands over the apathy of these young people, and, you know, apathy my ass. They're carrying the debt load my generation had if they had triplets or bought a big house, you know, and they're 20, you know. So I like that you're putting the focus back on the older people, like, you know, where are we in this? And I'm seeing that we need to be wrapping up. I guess it sounds like it sounds like a very tough fight to win, and one that arguably we're losing. What is the most hopeful thing you could leave listeners of this podcast with?
So I'll say the most hopeful thing is that when I go into a college and I see for the first time students who have for 18 years been socialized into the porn culture, into patriarchy, into a neoliberal attitude, and after an hour and a half, that house of cards of patriarchy and neoliberalism and racism, it begins to fall apart. Just an hour and a half it takes. Because you know why? It's all so flimsy. The ideology that legitimizes all these inequalities is so flimsy that it doesn't take much to pull one card out to give them some critical analysis, and suddenly the world makes sense. That's what I'm hopeful for. And as a professor who teaches students for 14 weeks, after 14 weeks, these students have a completely different view of the world. Now, if you can do that, then we should be out there educating and conscious raising, because the ideology that supports this system is flimsy and it doesn't take much to knock it down.
I love that you're saying that. You don't feel like that's colored by the fact that they have chosen to take your class and they're self-selecting?
No, in some of my classes, they're requirements. I think some of them were sorry they had to take it, but not afterwards. No.
Wonderful.
No, this is not self-selected. The upper level self-selected, but not the lower level classes, no. And it makes no difference whether it's upper level or lower level. After 14 weeks, these kids are just amazing. They are sophisticated thinkers. They think in terms of macro social effects. They think in terms of activism. It is just, I tell you what, keeps me hopeful and my students, to see the change in them, to see suddenly from even their bodies change, and the women and the men, but especially the women, become more powerful. You can see it. You can see the weight lifted off their shoulders, which is what feminism did, I'm sure, for you and me. It lifted that 10-ton weight of patriarchy off our shoulders. It made us who we are, and I get to do that week in, week out. I mean, God, am I fortunate or what?
Well, I try to do it with my plays, but the work is so heavily censored, sometimes it gets very frustrating for me. I think that, yes, I agree. A little bit of feminism is a huge catalyst for all kinds of critical thinking and transformation, individually and socially. That gives me hope. But how can women find more of a platform for that? You have a classroom, but the average person who's not a professor, what can she do?
Well, you know, as much as social media has had a terrible effect for many women and like brought out all the bully boys, I think we need to take over social media as one way of organizing. And there's feminists who do that. There's workshops on how feminists can get hold of social media, do that. But also there's nothing really replaces good old protests, right? Getting bodies out in the street protesting. So start an organization in your local area. Pornography is certainly something that galvanizes people. And if you go on to Stop Porn Culture, we've got resources up there. We also have conferences. We can help develop organizations all over. That is one of our goals, is to start movements going so that you can bring people together so they're not alone. Because the worst thing about all of this is feeling alone and feeling silenced. That is a recipe for disaster. And feminism is the answer to that. Feminism is absolutely the answer to that.
I love that you say that. I noticed on the Stop Porn Culture site that you offer slideshows so that anybody can do presentations.
Yeah. They're up there, and there'll be new ones going up soon. So all of those, we have resources.
Your documentary, Pornland, where can people get that? And what?
Okay, you can get that through Media Education Foundation. Just put Media Education Foundation in. You can also buy my book on Amazon. If you go on my website, gaildines.com, there's tons of my articles up there. Go on Stop Porn Culture. There's tons of resources up there as well. And join our organization. And then be part of a movement. Be part of a movement to say to the pornographers, we absolutely refuse to let you hijack our sexuality. Our next generation is worth more than your profits.
Well, I love that. I think that's a great note to end on. So I'm going to turn this back over to Jenny. I have to say that this has been really difficult for me to engage in because I'm so triggered. I keep...
I'm sorry. I'm sorry about that.
No, it's part of the work, but it's been... I felt like I was kind of... my brain was fading in and out, like a signal that was not coming in clear. Because this is where I have all the baffles and baffle chambers, and the synapsing around this particular area is not direct. But I just appreciate being able to interview someone who has such clarity about it, as well as such positive experiences of undoing it and such a commitment to activism. It gives me tremendous hope, and I think looking at the money behind pornography and the tidal wave of it and the easy... My father, he had to drive to some skanky part of town and worry about
the
parking lot. And I just want to quickly say that I'm understanding now, because of the Internet, women are becoming addicted to pornography in numbers almost as great as men. Is that what you're finding?
No, nowhere near. If you speak
it made me wonder, because it was pornography that was still about abusing women, and I thought, how's that work,
No. I mean, it's not happening, but no way is it anywhere close to the same thing.
No, that's good to know.
Yeah. But that's the kind of propaganda that the pornographers put out, actually. So anything, just don't believe a word the pornographers say. That's what I always say. Don't believe a word they say.
I think I had read that with some therapist, but who knows?
Well, you don't know. Yeah, it's not true. I mean, it certainly doesn't mean that there's not women becoming addicted to it, but there's no way that it's anywhere near the same.
I do think in the 50s, the accessing of it was much more problematic for women. The driving to those parts of town and being, alone, going into the store and buying it's easier for everybody now, but...
That's the problem. It's become affordable, accessible, and anonymous.
Yeah.
Yep.
Well, a lot to think about.
That's marathon interview.
Yeah. So, Jenny, are you there?
I am, and I want to thank you both very much, Professor Gail Dines and Carolyn Gage. Thank you.
Thank you. Take care.
Thank you, Gail.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
A very important and educational and sometimes shocking discussion, but with some very good news and solutions. Thank you both. And you can find out more about Gail's work on her website. Please go to gaildines.com. That's GAILDINES.com. And you'll also want to go to stoppornculture.org. dedicated to challenging the porn industry and the harmful culture that it perpetrates by bringing groups together into a movement. So it's stoppornculture.org. You can join this organization and become part of a movement. And you can find Gail's book, Pornland, How Porn Has Hijacked Our Sexuality, on our website at greenwomanstore.com. And also sign up for Carolyn Gage's interesting and very lively newsletter, carolyngage.com. Carolyn tours in her own shows and is available for lectures and workshops on lesbian culture and history. Thank you again, Gail Dines and Carolyn Gage. And thank you for listening in. We hope we have informed and inspired you in many ways, and we hope you will catch more of the interviews in this series on feminism and sustainability, as well as our other podcast series on important issues to us women. And please share these interviews with your family and friends. You never know who you may be inspiring. No matter what your description or experience of feminism is, we hope we have heightened your understanding of feminism's important role in all aspects of sustainability and restored and strengthened your resolve to build alliances for the future. For it is clear, as Gail Dines said, that none of us are really alone. Keep listening. Bye for now.